Steve, Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Might just be the two of you for now, hardcore learners who want to learn in Sukkot. I know that we've had a lot going on the last
people
few
may
days.
be templed out.
It's quite all right. But what I want to just say up front is that I can talk at you for an hour. I would much prefer to not do that. So I'm going to propose some framing and do some teaching, and then throw some questions along the way that I'm hoping will create conversation so we can learn together. We are in the holidays. Some people say, well, holidays are Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. At least in my family, when we say the high holidays, we really mean from Rosh Hashanah all the way through Simchat Torah, because it all goes together. And one of the things that we're going to do next week during Simchat Torah is we're really going to celebrate Torah. And we're going to go from the end of Deuteronomy back to Genesis, and it's all about the circular nature that every time you turn to something, you learn a little bit differently because you're a little bit different and because the world's a little bit different. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today and in the next couple of weeks of Lunch and Learn is how does Torah change as we change and as time has changed? Because we talk a lot about the covenant between God and Moses and the Israelites, but I can tell you that at least for me, I cannot really imagine what it's like wandering in the desert and what the experience of the Israelites were. And likewise, I don't think that they could even remotely consider that we are having a conversation on the computer 2,000 years later. Like all of this is so different, but the laws that we were given still apply. And that's one of the things that we teach our children in Bar Bat Mitzvah is that as they're learning these laws, it's like, well, why does this still matter when we received it 2,000 years ago? And the answer is that it actually still applies to our life. And if the goal that we have to be Jews who live according to Torah is the same goal that the Israelites had wandering in Egypt, and then when they got to the Promised Land, and then throughout history, if their goal was also to live Jewish, what I think the big thing that we do in Judaism is we take these laws, okay, what does it mean to honor your family, honor your parents, and think about it in our more contemporary society. And that's a big thing that Reform Judaism does. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And we're going to really look at this question of, well, how do we know how to live Jewishly? What exactly does that mean? Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Awesome. So original code of how do we live Jewishly is from the Torah. God told Moses, who then told the Israelites. And when the Israelites received Torah, they received both the written Torah and the oral Torah. Many people say the oral Torah, which was transmitted from generation to generation, eventually became what we know to be the Mishnah and the Gemara, which together become the Talmud, which is this intergenerational conversation amongst rabbis in the 4th, 5th, 6th century, really engaging in conversation about what does it mean to say the Shema every day. If it's a commandment to recite Shema, well, okay, so we have to say this at nighttime, and then the rabbis have a conversation of, well, what constitutes night? And I think that the way we would define night is probably in different terms than how the rabbis define night. But the commandments from God tell us what to do and what not to do. And then the oral Torah sort of tells us what that means. And that's where we get a lot of the interpretations of don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. It's in the oral Torah that we have then said that probably means don't mix milk and meat together, even though the cheese that we get here that comes from California or from Wisconsin, we generally know that we have meat cows and we have dairy cows. So the likelihood of mixing milk and meat from the same cow are very, very slim but that's how we get there. And so we have this interpretation, and most of the time in rabbinic Judaism, which is how we define Judaism from the time of the destruction of the temple and onward, when we move away from being a sacrifice-based religion to being more of a prayer and textually based tradition, we follow the authority of the rabbis, and that's this intergenerational conversation. And it begins in the Talmud, and then over time we have rabbis and we have commentators that create codes of Jewish law that sort of try to answer the keys of how to live Jewishly and what it means for them. And so Maimonides in the 12th century Egypt, he had a much different understanding of how to live Jewishly than the rabbis in the 4th and 5th century, and probably even from Joseph Caro, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch a few centuries later. And for a long time, these codes of Jewish law that really defined what mourning practices are, for example, and what does it mean to sit Shiva, and how do we care for the departed, and what happens in that time period between death and burial, and then periods of mourning since then. There hasn't been a unifying code of Jewish law since then. There hasn't been one form of interpretation that says this is what it means to live Jewishly. But we know that the world has changed since 16th century Italy. So that gets us to Reform Responsa. Before modernity, the Jews were a very, very text-based religion. And what that means is that the laws and the expectations of how to live Jewishly, they came from these texts. They came from how we interpreted things over time. And the text was a unifier, meant that everybody followed the same text. And when there wasn't literacy, there were the people that would then transmit the information, but it all, for the most part, was the same information. The Reform movement came as its own sect of Judaism in the beginning of the 19th century, end of the 19th century, 1800s, in Germany, and it eventually moved over to America. But the first Reform Responsa that I know about was in 1810. There was a letter written about what does it mean to keep kosher in the 1800s, and a rabbi wrote a responsum on if you can eat legumes. Can you eat beans on Passover? And I'm sure you guys know that this is actually a really big debate in Judaism. Do you eat kitniot? Do you not eat kitniot? It's a conversation starter. And in the 1800s, somebody wrote a letter that tried to justify his decision. And that justification was rooted in Jewish text, but it was trying to take a more contemporary approach to the answer, because the reason in favor or against eating legumes on Passover has changed a little bit. And there actually have been continual responses since then that happen in different sects of Judaism trying to come up with an answer. And there are responsa in favor and against this still. It's a very hot topic. And then as Reform Judaism was starting to establish itself as an independent entity of the more traditional sect of Judaism, Eliezer Lieberman published a compilation of responsum in order to justify all of the changes that were being made to a Reform service. So as the Reform movement is establishing itself, they're reforming from traditional Judaism, and the responsa made the practice okay, and it tried to create a set of unifiers for the Reform movement. So it wasn't just that everybody was doing something different, but that not only was there this unification, but it was also rooted in text and tradition as well, and that these changes weren't just coming from thin air. And so the responsa was a modern approach to let the text lead you to different practices. And then if we fast forward a few decades, we get to American Reform Judaism. This is when the first German rabbis moved to America. And Isaac Mayer Wise was one of the founders of First Seminary, Hebrew Union College. And he also founded the Central Conference for American Rabbis, which is basically our Reform Union. And he did this to try to centralize Reform Judaism and really picture what the Reform movement in America was going to look like. And there were a lot of tensions about how to practice. What were they keeping? What were they adjusting? How were these changes going to impact the world? And really, a lot of these questions were, how can we be both Jewish and American at the same time? And what does that look like? Because a lot of people coming to America at this time were coming and not wanting to be Jewish in the same way that they had been in Eastern Europe. And so the first Reform Responsa Committee tried to establish what practice would look like. How long would Shiva last? And it really established precedent. And one of my favorite questions that they ask is, well, can Torah reading in Reform Judaism be done completely in English? Because that was an easier way of connecting to the text. And throughout history, we know that text had been read in the vernacular. And some rabbis said, absolutely, you can read it in English. And then one of the things that really came out of this was, you can read it in English as long as you're also reading it in the original text. But some of the tension in these conversations, because it starts out as a written answer, but then in the 1900s, they were having conversations. These responsa, these written questions and answers would then turn into conversations. And one of the big things that they were thinking about at the time was, well, does that make my practice obsolete if I don't have access to a Torah? So a lot of these new communities that were being established in the early 20th century didn't have Torah scrolls. And this sort of raised an interesting question about what's the difference between practice and policy? And what does it mean for these conversations to happen without codifying? And the Reform movement is not a halakhically based sect of Judaism. It means that we don't follow Jewish law to a T, but we still have responsa. And actually, we are going to look today at some responsa that are very, very contemporary, that try to sort of paint a picture of what's going on in the world and what one lens of Jewish text is to look at it. And one of the things in the 1900s that they realized is that these conversations were really important, and policy and practice could be different, that the Reform movement wasn't saying, we're setting this responsa, we're asking this question, and then that's going to be what it's going to be. But in fact, there's space for a little bit of wiggle room and for different communities to do what's right for them. And the CCAR then formed a committee where they set policy in place, like these are things that actually you need to follow. But by and large, when we talk about responsa, we talk about guidelines as opposed to mandates. Responsa is fascinating because it's not policy. It really takes time for this practice to gain momentum. And so in the early 20th century, there were not a lot of questions being asked to the rabbis, where they would write their own questions. They'd say, this is what we're thinking about. This is in terms of how to live Jewishly in America. We're going to ask the question and begin the conversation this way. And over time, that's evolved. There's now a responsa committee with like 16 or 20 rabbis across the country that are all Reform rabbis, and they receive questions from specific rabbis based on situations in their own world, in their own community, and want this wide range of expertise because they're looking for that authority elsewhere. And as we're going to see in a few minutes, sometimes the responsa committee will ask their own question to answer because they've received it from so many different places that they just want to streamline the experience. So what is responsa? I've talked a lot about it, but I haven't actually defined it. Responsa are questions that get asked to Jewish authority about how to live Jewishly. How can we translate what's in the Torah and what's in the Talmud into our contemporary lives? Given that we have internet, given that when we talk about community, we're also talking about this virtual space that we can talk together over the computer. And our needs are different. And so we need to ask different questions. The rabbis didn't necessarily know all of the questions to ask. Just like as a new rabbi, I definitely don't know all the questions to ask. And that's part of the learning process. Similarly, as we figure out where we are in our own contemporary society and our relationship between being Jewish and being American in this case, we start to ask more questions as different things come up, and it helps people have informed decisions on what they do for their own Jewish practice. So we're going to look at one that is very, very contemporary and appropriate. This is a question that is called Virtual Minyan in the Time of the COVID-19 Emergency. This was written in 5780. So we just started 5783. So this was 3 years ago. This was in like September of 2020. Yes. This was in the very early stages of COVID. This was in 2020. So the question is, may we rely on technology to create a virtual minyan in a time of crisis when we cannot gather in our synagogues? If so, what are the criteria for constituting a valid virtual minyan? How does one recite Kaddish in a virtual minyan? And at what point do we know it is appropriate to discontinue the virtual minyan and return to a physical minyan? So this was submitted by a number of rabbis asking, how do we lead online services? How do we create this community that has a need? We all need to gather. We need to be able to say Kaddish. We need to think about how we read Torah. We need to think about what our worship goals are in a time of COVID when we can't come together. And this was at the very, very, very beginning of COVID. So a couple of questions to consider. Oh, go ahead, Margaret.
I wondered, did the conservative have this same situation? Did they just get together and stay far apart with their masks on?
So the conservative movement has their own Responsa committee. They asked this question also. I did not put this in because I'm just focusing on reform.
I'm just curious if they too was doing this.
They did virtual minyanim as well. And I actually know some loopholes that the Orthodox communities did. So in Los Angeles, there were, because the weather was nice, even when they weren't supposed to, I know some Orthodox communities that would set chairs outside and space them apart sort of before that was the thing to do. But I also know a lot of Orthodox synagogues that would set up the Zoom to automatically go, and they would just leave their computers out and they wouldn't touch it. Nobody would touch their, and if you click log in before Shabbat, then it would just all be there, and then your computer would be left open, but the Zoom would be on, you could worship. And then, so that was a loophole that some of our more traditional neighbors came through.
Thank you.
So some questions to think about as we go through this responsa. What is this question really asking? What is innovative about this question? Because we had a live stream before COVID, right? We were able to live stream services from Bethel. Our production quality has gotten better, but we've had cameras in the building. And what would be important to you when thinking about answering this question? So if you can think back to March of 2020, what do you hope the rabbis include as they answer this question? So these are just some questions to think about as we go through. So the answer, although we have a recent decision that rejects the virtual minyan, and so that means that there had previously been conversations that say you can't just pray on the computer. That's not what a community is. You need to be in person, and we value online community. We are now in an emergency situation. In an emergency situation, a Beit Din, so a rabbinic court of 3 rabbis, is responsible for taking action for the welfare of the community and may issue a temporary ruling, which is called a hora'at sha'ah, to prevent the community from going astray. So their first goal is to say that this is not a permanent thing. This is emergency authorization use so that we can keep the community together. People will certainly go astray by turning to all sorts of sources of comfort if we do not ensure that the Kehila Kedosha, our holy community, can continue to function. So they are really saying, in the time of COVID, what can we do to keep everybody together? Because we don't want the community to fall apart, especially smaller communities that might be a little bit more fragile, and we want to think about what it means to function. So one of the next category of this answer is that called the minyan and participation outside of the minyan. So what does it mean to be a part of like a worship minyan, and what are we talking about participation wise outside of worship? So the essence of the minyan is the reciprocity of the social contract, the shared obligation that binds all 10 individuals to another, transforming them from a number of individuals into a community. So we still, and they're calling it a virtual Beit Yisrael. So the whole point of coming together is to remember that you're in a community and that you're not just praying individually, that Judaism doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's part of why it's so important for us to have 10 people to pray to begin with. So the halakha, the Jewish law, translated that conceptual essence into a physical one by mapping it onto a space, requiring that the members of a minyan be in one room together. The majority view in the halakha, in the Jewish law, is that the individuals who constitute the minyan must be in one room, although some authorities hold that it is sufficient for them to be able to see each other, thus including the individual who is visible through the window of the synagogue. So this is beginning to say that when you're praying in a room, being in a Zoom room, you can count 10 people because you can actually see everybody with whom you're praying. And all of this comes, in this one, I put all the sources at the bottom. So this is from, these pieces of Jewish law come from the Talmud, from the Shulchan Aruch, which I pointed out was from Joseph Caro in the 16th century, and from another piece of Jewish law. Now, however, we are in a situation, this way it'll look prettier. Now, however, we are in a situation where people may not gather in one room. Therefore, for the duration of this emergency, whatever that means, we permit the convening of a minyan by means of interactive technology. So technology that enables all members of the minyan to see and hear each other. Two widely used examples of this type of technology are Zoom, available as a smartphone app, and Microsoft Teams. In essence, therefore, we are requiring the use of Zoom or Teams or any app with the same capability that may appear on the market now to constitute a virtual minyan. As always, and especially in this time of economic distress, we presume our congregations and all our people will adhere to all intellectual property and copyright laws as they obtain software. And actually, this year we had a really interesting question, because last year during the high holidays, the CCAR, our rabbinic union, offered a free flipbook version of the Machzor for all of our congregants that were online. And this year they said, due to copyright, we're not able to provide that. So you either need to provide the book or people need to pay for the Kindle version if they want digital access. So the copyright thing is interesting, but the Responsa is saying, in this time of emergency, you need to be on Zoom. You need to be able to see faces, and you need to be able to see and hear people in order for the community to continue. Which I'm curious of your thoughts of just this part, how services might have felt different if you were sitting at home and being able to see everybody you were praying with instead of just the live stream function where you just saw the rabbis and the cantors and the musicians.
The feeling is very different. You don't get the same feeling of community.
Do you think you would have felt more connected in that way? Or would it have been more chaotic, do you think?
Not chaotic, but sitting in your t-shirt and your casual clothes, and it's just different.
Right. And if you saw, I think if you are able to see people on the Zoom, then people, at least from my experience, were more likely to at least put on a nicer shirt. You might still be in your slippers, but it also sets you up for a little bit different experience than if you're just sitting and watching in bed because you know that nobody's going to see you.
Yes. But actually, when we live stream, you can see, like, sometimes they'll scan the audience, the congregation a little bit, or you can see the first few rows, or it is nice. But at least you feel you're joining in. But
the bird's eye view helps. You might maybe
can't
feel
have
like
all
you're
of us
sitting
on
in
the
the
screen
pew.
at the same time. It would be ridiculous.
That's true. Because I think
Yeah.
Zoom makes it so it's hard to see more than like 20 or 25 Zoom boxes. So then you
It's
spend the
wonderful
time.
for a service. It's a hard thing to do.
It's hard for sure. So then this
I think
continues.
we've done a good job with it.
You think we've done a good job?
I do.
Me too. As long as there are 10 people connected in an interactive manner, any number of additional people may also be present passively via live streaming. So they're saying as long as you have 10 people that can see each other, then you've crossed that minion threshold. In accordance with precedent 5772.1. So the way that the responsa get labeled is by year. So we're in the year 55,783. So this is talking about, you can't see me pointing at my computer. This is talking about a responsa that was written 11 years ago. So that was even 8 years before this particular responsa. So they're saying that there was a question about, can you count virtual people in a minion 11 years ago? And they said, well, not if you can't see them. So they're citing themselves here. And they say, in our current context, the obstacle to counting the live stream viewer in the minion is that they cannot be seen or heard, and therefore cannot be an equal participant in the minion's underlying social contract. Additionally, there's no way for the service leader to know how many people, if any, are watching a live stream, and therefore no way of knowing whether a minion is present in the absence of 10 interconnected members. We affirm that one who is viewing a live stream should still respond to all the prayers. This is considered the same as having recited them. The same is true for the live stream viewer who recites the words of the mourner's Kaddish along with the service leader. So this is saying that even if you're live streaming, in order to be an active participant, you must respond like you're there. But it's kind of a catch-22 because they're also saying that you're not counted in the same way because the service leader doesn't know if you're there. But most of the time we don't make a habit of counting for a minion because we at Temple Bethel are lucky that we know that generally there are more than 10 people. So the CCAR has never taken a stand on whether a minion is required for public prayer. So we've never actually said that we won't pray with fewer than 10 people. And most rabbis that I know at least try to find loopholes. So if you're in a small community and there are 7 people plus you, be like, well, we have 2 Torah scrolls, so we'll count that. That way people can still say Kaddish. But its importance has been a given for most Reform rabbis. So it's not required, but most rabbis still see this value. In 1936, Jacob Mann advised that every attempt should be made to have a full minion. So I don't know if you've ever been a part of these where I was traveling a number of years ago and there were 8 people and one really needed to say Kaddish for a parent and was saying it every day. And we had 8 people. And I remember somebody went running around trying to find 2 more people. Or if you've seen this at an airport, Steve, I don't know if anybody's come up to you and be like, are you Jewish? Will you come join our minion? So because It's that
is
time.
not-
It's not happened to you? It's happened to men that I've been with. Maybe they just look more Jewish.
Even on Mrs. Maisel, they had to run out and get the mailman or the milkman or something for a
Well, next
brisk.
time
You
next
saw
time you're in
that.
an airport and you look like you're like near a lot of Orthodox people or going to Israel, God willing, you'll notice this now. It still happens. But yes, in Mrs. Maisel when they go out and get the mailman. So there's a lot of attempt to have this full minyan in it because we know that there are people out there. But in 1936, they say, but they allowed congregations, and remember in 1936, most of these congregations were much smaller, to rely on the Palestinian custom of fixing a minyan at 6 or 7. And many small congregations rely on this in order to be able to come together to pray to begin with, because they don't have that critical mass. Some congregations of varying sizes disregard the minyan completely. We are not saying now that every Reformed congregation must adhere to the requirement of a minyan of 10, but we encourage it even in small congregations as a way of bringing it together. So here you can sort of see the rabbis trying to open doors for people and for congregations, but saying, but it's still not what we want you to do. Like in an ideal world, you'll have 10 people all on the screen who can see each other. But if that's not the case, here are a couple of other avenues. So then they come to the question of Torah reading. All parts of the service can be conducted in a virtual minyan with the obvious exception of actually reading from a Torah scroll. So they're saying, so as a further hora'at sha'ah, so as a further way of just acknowledging this moment and doing emergency authorization, it is sufficient to read from a printed text without any aliyot. So this is saying at the March of 2020, when nobody was in the building. I don't know what it was like here in Florida. I know that I led services from my studio apartment for about 6 months. And we never thought even about bringing a Torah scroll to my apartment. But what we did, and what we did also at seminary, was we would read printed Torah, like what you would find in a commentary. And you wouldn't say the blessing because you weren't calling somebody up to the physical Sefer Torah, but you still were able to gather to read Torah together. However, this is still a fulfillment of the mitzvah of Torah study and requires a blessing, but it's a different blessing than reading Torah. So you would say the blessing before Torah study as opposed to the blessing before reading Torah. Under these present circumstances, the height of COVID, we suggest reverting to the practice set forth in the Mishnah. So 200 CE, where the practice was that the first reader would recite the blessing before reading and the last reader would recite the blessing after reading, because you're not calling additional people up because they can't watch you read. And they weren't doing aliyot of other people in their home. So I was home alone. I couldn't have somebody else get called up to the Torah and watch me read. And part of our practice in Torah reading is that we call somebody up. It's why on the high holidays, when we have the translators for Torah and for Haftorah, everybody's up on the Torah by the Torah table. It might seem like it's a little crowded up there, but the important part is that everybody's there watching the Torah be read and reading the translation on the same table as the Sefer Torah. An alternative practice, so for those who don't want to use the Torah blessings for anything other than reading from the scrolls, so recognizing that there is sort of a variance between Reform Jews, is to recite the blessing for Torah study before reading the printed text. Either way, we also strongly encourage including serious Torah study in addition to the reading. So they're saying here that while prayer is a little bit more complicated, you can certainly learn together on Zoom. As demonstrated by this, we can still learn, we can still talk on Zoom, and God knows we've had enough meetings on Zoom in the last several years. And so they're encouraging Torah study because they know that there's a much lower barrier to entry than there is for reading from a Sefer Torah scroll. So the duration of these temporary practices, how long is this going to be okay? Because once you start going to services in your slippers, it's hard to get out of that. And so they put this into the response of thinking ahead, knowing God willing, things were going to get better, that things were really hard and complicated, but we were going to get more information. I mean, I don't know what it was like here, but I know that the first 2 weeks of when the pandemic was at its worst, we were like wiping down and washing the outside of our Cheerios boxes. And we quickly learned that that wasn't how things got transmitted. So as we learned, how is this going to change? So then the rabbi said, finally, at some point in the future, we know that this health crisis will end. When the authorities stop restricting attendance at public functions, this Horat Sha'ah should be set aside. So when the government, when all of the other communities say that it is safe to gather, we will gather again. And this goes back to something called Dina de Malchuta Dina, which means the law of the land is the law. So the rabbis here are saying, we're following the lead of the law of the land. So we're coming up with this emergency plan for this moment, but as soon as we can, we want to get back in. We know that your slippers are comfy, but we're going to really, really emphasize that the value of that is temporary. People should return to the synagogue, and the practice of interactive virtual minyanim should cease. We realize that some people may be fearful, but we rely on experts in these matters. As rabbis, we are not competent to render judgments in scientific controversies. So the rabbis here are recognizing their limitations as rabbis and saying that what we can speak to is the value of gathering together. And I know that the virtual minyanim still have great, great importance, and that's part of why we still have them and why we still are investing in production quality. But even since I've been here, I've noticed that the numbers have gotten bigger in person, and everybody that I talk to is like, it just feels so much better to be in the space and to be around people. So the priority is to really emphasize that. Still, we do not hesitate to adopt the overwhelming view as our standard of guidance in this and all other issues where science is the determining factor. Nevertheless, individuals in the most vulnerable populations, especially the elderly with pre-existing medical conditions, may benefit from live streaming. In these circumstances, the precedent of our earlier responsum from 11 years ago offers sufficient guidance, which is why we still have live streaming options and which is why we still encourage participation that way, because participation is better than not participating. And if we go back to the very beginning of this response, they're saying that what's most important is how we use the synagogue as a connector. And so if live streaming continues to be a connector, it should still be offered. But we want to remind people that there is value to going in person. So then there's a question a year later that says, well, what guidelines should we follow for returning safely to in-person gatherings in our congregations? So 1 year later, things are a little bit different. And every synagogue is doing things a little bit different. And every community is doing things a little bit different. And we know a lot more about this pandemic. We have a lot more information. So somebody from Portland, Maine, sends a question to the Responsa committee and says, okay, well, how can we safely go back to in-person gatherings? What is entailed in that? I know what was entailed in going virtual, but now what do we look for as we start to undo this? And as we read this, I really want you to think about the fact that this was written 2 years ago, and we know so much more and have so much more information now. So feel free to stop me and we can talk about how we would change this, knowing what we know in 2022 that we perhaps didn't know a year ago. So the answer is, we are accustomed to illness, disease, hospital, and hospices. We know that COVID is not the first disease ever that we've dealt with. We and our loved ones suffer and die from any number of frightening illness, but we've tamed and even eliminated all the contagious diseases that were a common feature of human existence until the last 2 or 3 generations. Smallpox, measles, mumps, polio, I'm not going to try to pronounce that one. Cholera, bubonic plague.
Diphtheria.
Say it again.
Diphtheria.
Diphtheria. There you go. Learn something new. The prospect of a new and deadly contagious illness is partially terrifying to many people, perhaps especially to highly educated, affluent first world residents who are accustomed to being in control of their lives and their environments. So this is beginning by saying there actually are other things that have threatened us in this world, and this is really scary, and we don't have autonomy, and so there's a lot of fear going into this, but we also have a history of dealing with other diseases that have plagued human existence. Now, however, we must face the reality that COVID is here to stay in one way, shape, or form. It is not going to disappear any more than the flu or the common cold have disappeared. It is good that we know how to reduce the risk of its transmission, which we did not know at the beginning of all of this. High quality masks, frequent hand washing, and social distancing. It is good that healthcare workers know much more than they did a year ago about how to treat COVID-19. And it is amazingly good that vaccines give us the means to reduce almost to zero the likelihood of an infected person becoming seriously ill. In theory, when enough people are vaccinated, we will attain herd immunity, i.e. the virus will find it extremely difficult, though not impossible, to find new hosts, and instances of illness will gradually decrease. And I know that that's definitely a complicated topic, and vaccines are controversial, especially knowing what we know now, where there seems to be strain after strain and there's a lot of different science out there, and it's sometimes hard to keep track. So I do know that that's definitely controversial. However, we do not know whether future variants will be more or less deadly, more or less transmissible. We definitely have seen that with Delta and Omicron, which were both variants after this was written. The virus is already mutated, producing more contagious variants, and there's no way to be certain that some future, even more deadly variation, even a vaccine-resistant variation, will not emerge. So we must accept that the reality that we are living in a different world than we were just over a year ago, because this new disease is a reality that will not disappear. So with all of this said, and with a lot of unknowns still up in the air, we must figure out how to live with it, and we must live with it. So they're saying, let us recognize what a difficult moment this is. This tshuva will necessarily be somewhat provisional as we acclimate ourselves to this new normal. People are emerging from the depths of the pandemic with a wide range of emotional responses to their experiences of the last 16 months. There are those who will simply want to plunge back into life as it was before COVID, and those who will never feel safe going back no matter what. So everybody's coming in with their own feelings and own beliefs about this and own fears. Scientists and health professionals have learned a tremendous amount about this brand new disease in an astonishingly short span of time, including how to treat it and how to prevent its spread. Yet there's still more to be learned, and there's also the possibility of new variants. The reality is also that some people cannot be safely vaccinated. As of this writing, the COVID-19 vaccines are widely and easily available in the US, but less so in Canada. Federal, state, and local laws regarding masking, social distancing, and vaccine requirements are not uniform. And finally, the politicization of the pandemic has opened the doors to a flood of misinformation and disinformation. Congregations trying to establish responsible protocols may have to deal with individual members influenced by this sort of thing. So this is saying that the politics have entered also, and they're going to try to come up with an answer knowing that it's different in different states and different towns, and different people all have different feelings about this. And so all of this is like 2 paragraphs so far of lead up. They haven't even begun to answer the question yet. However, there are some core principles which we must articulate, and some guidance that we can offer. In this response, we address the implications of the new reality of virtual gatherings and the need to balance the public good and the needs and concerns of individuals in reopening. We note that no responsum can possibly speak to the particular dynamics of every individual congregation. So what we need here at Temple Bethel is very different than what the congregation in Portland, Maine might need, because we have a different population, different demographic, different size, different resources. And all we can do is articulate the guidance our tradition offers. So this is going to take what we know from Jewish text and ask that congregations take it to heart in good faith. But again, this is not policy. This is trying to provide space of good practice through Jewish text. Does that make sense? This is trying really to take the Jewish laws and Jewish lessons and translate it into this very, very contemporary reality that we find ourselves in. Global pandemics weren't new, but all of the resources that we have with being able to gather virtually are new. So the first part is gathering in safety. The vaccine has made it possible for us to move away from the time of acute danger, but we are not yet returning to life as it was before the pandemic. Our tradition offers us some significant guidelines for the new normal. So the first is saving a life, or the value of pikuach nefesh. While the obligation to save life supersedes all of the mitzvot except the 3 cardinal transgressions, this should not be understood as some sort of blanket mandate to remain under acute lockdown conditions until absolute safety can be guaranteed for everyone. So they're saying that the Talmud's classic examples of saving a life are all acts in response to an acute emergency, such as rescuing a child from drowning or preparing food on Shabbat for someone suffering from a potentially fatal illness. So they're saying lighting fire, which is traditionally one of the 39 things you can't do on Shabbat, is okay if it's done to cook food for somebody who's dying. Setting ongoing standards for safe public behavior in response to a public health crisis is not, strictly speaking, pikuach nefesh. And so for that, we have to look elsewhere. The danger to life and the obligation to preserve well-being. So the Torah commands that anybody building a house must put a parapet around its roof, lest somebody fall and die. So if somebody is breaking into your house and they fall off of your roof and land in the pool and they die, Judaism would say that you're actually liable for that person, even though they were breaking and entering. From this commandment, Jewish law derives the principle of acting responsibly, both with respect to one's own life and to that of others, to avoid sakanat nefashot, the danger to life. So then Maimonides says it is a positive commandment to remove any obstacle that could pose a danger to life, and be careful regarding these matters, as scripture, as Torah says, take utmost care and guard your lives carefully. So that comes from Deuteronomy. If a person leaves a dangerous obstacle and does not remove it, he negates the observance of a positive commandment and violates the negative commandment. Do not incur blood guilt. So what this is here is, this is 12th century Maimonides reflecting on Torah, on Deuteronomy. And in a minute, our 2021 rabbis are going to then respond to Maimonides, who's responding to this, to try to tie it up in a bow for their purposes. Our sages forbade many matters because they involve a threat to life. Whenever a person transgresses these guidelines, saying, I will risk my life, what does this matter to others? Or I am not careful about these things, he should be punished by lashes for rebelliousness. In other words, and this is our 2021 rabbis, we are obligated as Jews to avoid causing danger to others. However, Maimonides also emphasized the individual's responsibility to make every effort to take care of themselves by following sound medical advice. So since maintaining a healthy and sound body is among the ways of God, for one cannot understand or have any knowledge of the Creator if he is ill. Therefore, he or she must avoid that which harms the body and accustom themselves to that which is healthful and helps the body become stronger. Whoever conducts himself in the ways which we have drawn up, I will guarantee that he will not become ill throughout his life until he reaches advanced age and dies. He will not need a physician. His body will remain intact and healthy. Well, we know that's not entirely true, because we have a little bit more information on medicine. And even if you take perfect care of your body, there are still reasons to see physicians. But we need to make every effort to take care of our bodies. And then a 20th century authority sums up the matter as follows. So now we've jumped ahead. So what our 2021 rabbis are doing is they're taking all of these different sources to weave them to try to find an answer. And similarly, one should be careful of all the things that could put one in danger, and therefore it is forbidden to walk in a place of danger, such as underneath a tilting wall or alone at night in an unsafe place. Similarly, they prohibited drinking from these rivers at night or putting one's mouth on a pipe while drinking from it, for all these things are potentially dangerous. They also wrote that one should flee the city during a time of plague, God forbid, and one should leave the city at the start of a plague and not at its end, because by then the plague is already strengthened. All of these things are forbidden because of danger, and one who guards their life will keep far from them. It is forbidden to rely on a miracle or to endanger one's life in this way. So from all of this, we see that we are obligated to take precautions to avoid obvious dangers to others, sakanat nefashot, the danger to our bodies, but we are simultaneously expected to take responsibility for our own safety, health, and well-being, which is the Jewish value of shmirat haguf. These are complementary standards of behavior. The obligation to avoid sakanat nefashot is my obligation to ensure that my behavior does not constitute a danger to others. And the obligation of shmirat haguf is my obligation to preserve my own health and well-being. Collectively, we are obligated to avoid behaviors that are obvious dangers to others. And individually, we are responsible for maintaining our health as best as we can. So then they continue and they say there's an obligation to seek medical assistance and to use proven medicine. Shmirat haguf includes the individual's obligation to seek proven medical care and to follow proven medical advice. The practice of medicine is more than a skill, it is a mitzvah, as the Talmud and the codes of Jewish law make clear. It is a commandment to heal like a physician, and this includes the principle, and you shall restore it to him, meaning restoring somebody's life. If somebody sees that someone is perishing and they are able to save him, they must do so, whether by physical exertion, by monetary outlay, or by the knowledge they possess. And we also know that our tradition teaches us if you've saved the life of one person, it is as if you've saved the whole world. But if the healer is obligated to heal, the individual is also obligated to seek and take treatment. We may even compel someone to accept a treatment if it is proven to be efficacious. Indeed, on that basis, this committee decided some years ago that religious schools may require their students to be immunized. So they're saying that school children who go to school and are required to be vaccinated to go to school for things like polio and smallpox, they are also required to be vaccinated at religious schools. So that's nothing new, but they're going to use all of this to then ask the question, are the COVID-19 vaccines proven medicine? Because that was a very controversial question a year and a half ago. So the vaccines that have been approved for use in the US and Canada are definitely proven medicine from a Jewish perspective. For this answer, we rely on the extensive and masterful responsum of the conservative posek, Rabbi David Golinkin, adopted in January 2021 by the Rabbinical Assembly's Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. So Margaret, here's conservative Judaism coming back. So the Reform movement is saying, the conservative rabbis already had this conversation and we liked what they said. So now we're putting that into our answer. So the Rabbinical Assembly is the conservative version of this. So Rabbi Golinkin's comprehensive survey of rabbinic rulings of the last 2 centuries reveals a clear consensus that the benefit of a vaccine to millions of people mandates its use as a life-saving medicine, not to be limited or dispensed with because of a tiny number of adverse reactions. With regard to the original smallpox inoculations, for example, remembering that this has happened before, Rabbi Golinkin quotes Rabbi Avraham Nanzik, who wrote in 1785 concerning the 1 in 1,000 who died from the smallpox inoculation. We do not eliminate such a great benefit for the sake of such a tiny minority. Negative reactions to the COVID vaccine are infinitely fewer than 1 in 1,000. Rabbi Golinkin's comprehensive list includes nearly 24 rabbinic rulings from the last 2 centuries about the importance of vaccinations while noting that the current COVID-19 vaccines are more efficacious and more rigorously tested than virtually all the ones addressed in these rulings. So what they're saying is that this has actually been a question before in Judaism, and rabbis from 200 years ago were having this exact same conversation and came to a consensus. And we're not expecting our congregants to know that, because I didn't know about these semi-random rabbis from the 1700s, but we want to bring them into light so that they know that our policy isn't just coming from nothing, but it's actually coming from rabbis that have had this conversation before, which is part of this chain of transmission that we value so much in Judaism. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
We will. Then they say, we note that the fact that the vaccines currently have only emergency authorization is irrelevant from the perspective of Jewish law, which is concerned with the vaccine's tested efficacy and safety, not with the details of government regulations differing between emergency and regular use. In other words, as Rabbi Lincoln's responsa makes clear, the vaccines are refuah b'tuka, proven medicine as our tradition understands the concept. Questions, comments, concerns, reflections?
Well, it's interesting. I think in the Orthodox community, they really weren't getting the vaccine as in other communities. So I wonder what their rationalization was for that.
That's a very good question. I don't know. I definitely I find Responsa extremely fascinating. We have Responsa for everything, and I have done pretty extensive reading on Responsa from the Reform and the Conservative movement, but not so much from the Orthodox. And one of the things I've learned is that while we have this central body, the CCAR, and while the Conservative movement has the RA, the Orthodox movement they have the Orthodox Union, but they also have a lot of pockets where they have more space for differing interpretations of the halakha of the Jewish law. So it's very possible that some of them would have one response and others would have other responses, which is my guess.
I'm
what happened.
Curious why, what was going on with that. I mean,
I'll do some research, see what I can
not
find.
to be very political, but there had to be a reason.
Totally. There had to be a reason, and it's something I can look into. And my hope for bringing this was not to bring a political conversation, but really to show.
No,
But was to show that we're having.
just say,
Go ahead, Margaret. I'm sorry.
I said I wasn't bringing it up for politics, but the Orthodox community does have some different views of maybe, strong views, shall I say.
And I think the important thing is that in Reform movement, and when we talk about Responsa and all of these Q&As of how do we live Jewishly, we use the Jewish text to help us find practice. And then the policy comes after and is a lot further and fewer between when we talk about Reform policy. And in the Orthodox movement, it's all one and the same, because this is how we interpret Jewish law, so this has to be how it works. And in Reform movement, and to an extent in the Conservative movement, there's a little bit more of that wiggle room. So this, again, it was just how they were using Jewish text to justify how this very contemporary, very secular part of our life could be seen Jewishly. And both the Reform and the Conservative movements created a lot of blessing around this to try to create ritual for this Jewish practice, even though it wasn't policy, even though it came later that it was required in a lot of places, but not everywhere, to be vaccinated.
Well, I think it's interesting because it never occurred to me. I don't know how you feel about it, Steve, but I never thought about the thing about the minion and is there a problem because we're not meeting, all that. So I'm glad it's a subject you brought up. It's something to think about.
I hope that this is
to me that was part of what was going on.
I'm glad it was interesting. We will get to using non-alcoholic beverages in different parts of Jewish tradition that generally require wine. But I wanted to start with this because I thought that it was just so applicable in our lives and something that we all went through and all have our own lived experience. And thought it was an interesting way to start bringing in the ideas. So thank you both so much for joining me for lunch.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And I'll see you guys.
I like Zoom.
I definitely think it's a great resource.
Well, I have to tell you, it has allowed me to do more things. I mean, sometimes I have a meeting and it's way out at the Federation campus. It takes me 40 some minutes to get there. Then I got to come back and do something at the office. Then, I mean, today I had some kind of webinar for business. I mean, it's fantastic that we have this resource. It gives you a lot more time.
Gives you a lot more time. And when I was living in Los Angeles, the idea of cutting my commute time from 30 minutes on a good day to 0 minutes, I suddenly had so much more time in my day.
I have to go.
All right.
Thank
Have a good afternoon.
Bye. Thank
Bye,
you.
Margaret.